I'm Charli Cox. I'm here for Raw Speech on Raw 12:51 AM, and I'm very lucky to be joined by Emily Taylor, who is an Associate Fellow from Chatham House, editor of the Journal and Journal of Cyber Policy, and basically a huge expert in internet governance and privacy. I'm very lucky to have you. How are you doing?
Oh, very well, thanks. I've really enjoyed my evening at Warwick. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, that's all right. Emily's just given a talk which you can check out on the rest of Raw's YouTube, but if you could just kind of give like a summary quickly of kind of what the talk was about. You talked a lot about sort of the problems with the internet and democracy. If you could give like a speed tour of what you were chatting about.
So, a speed tour of the talk. We were thinking about who really won the US elections. Was it Donald Trump? Was it Russia? Or was it Facebook? And so we looked and unpacked each of these three theories and looked at some of the underlying economic and social problems that might have caused Donald Trump to be popular, looked at evidence of foreign interference, and also looked at the ways in which social media platforms were used by the candidates to reach a very targeted audiences.
And I guess that's kind of something really interesting, especially sort of the Russia part that you touched on very briefly, is sort of, are we kind of in danger of assuming that within cyber warfare it's only the bad guys to blame? So sort of a lot of the talk about like cyber warfare, it's always the Russians or it's always sort of another state. Is that, do you think there needs to be more acknowledgement of sort of the US's or the UK's part in cyber warfare, or do you think it's mainly the other side?
Well, I think everybody from their own perspective will feel under attack. This is a new environment, and generally where states are finding that actually it's quite easy to launch fairly effective attacks, no matter which state is doing that, then that does lead to a lot of public concern. We can't understand what happened in the US elections just by thinking about foreign states, but I think we would be also foolish to ignore that. And generally the approach of democratic states and more authoritarian regimes is different. So whereas it's absolutely true to say that there are active measures on both sides of the equation, the objectives might be different and the kind of means are different too.
Interesting. I guess sort of on from that, with the talk focused a lot on the 2016 election in the US. Do you think that sort of in comparing sort of social media use and sort of the hacking, as well as we'll get on to sort of the other journalistic parts in a bit, which do you think played more of a part in Donald Trump's win? Do you think there's a definitive answer, or do you think they're too intertwined?
I think that something that was new is the role of social media. It certainly has been used in previous campaigns, but I think in the 26th election almost everything came together. And disinformation campaigns by states are not new, but what is really new is the manipulation of the algorithms that attract like-minded people to each other on social media platforms, which means that messages can resonate and people can be really micro-targeted by candidates without that necessarily being visible to a wider public.
Interesting. So do you think that sort of in the future social media is going to get even bigger? Do you think there needs to be sort of more regulations on social media? Sort of where do you stand with that in terms of election content?
I think that future election candidates, certainly successful candidates, will need to have a very organised approach to social media. And in a way, I think that perhaps some of the more extreme results that we've seen over the last couple of years, that comparative advantage of candidates who got their head around it will diminish. Where you have a communications media that can reach so many people so effectively and profile them so effectively, and where that has a real measurable outcome on democracy, then you're going to find that regulation follows.
I guess as well, something that obviously social media affects lots more than sort of other generations. The younger generation is something that's so deeply, sort of social media is so deeply ingrained in like our culture. Do you think that sort of the use of social media in campaigns, do you think that's upped young sort of like votership and everything, kind of moving away from 2016 so much, I guess, and more into sort of the 2017 UK election? Do you think that sort of social media helps to increase young votership, and do you think that's something that's going to continue, or sort of along those kinds of lines?
It's difficult to tell. I think one of the things that might have upped the proportion of young people who voted in 2017 was the Brexit election, which the outcome of that referendum was something that most young people would have voted against if they had voted. And I think the shock of the Brexit election on your generation probably played more of a role, in my opinion, in motivating you to actually participate in that more recent election.
I guess as well, sort of, if we move away from social media and sort of into, obviously there are lots of problems with data protection and hacking and social media and everything to do with that. Do you think that the internet still has an important sort of role to play in democracy, looking more at sort of like access to information and stuff like that, or does that kind of lead onto a whole other host of problems with journalism, with sort of free journalism and all that?
No, I think that the internet has a massive potential, and the internet has absolutely revolutionised access to knowledge and made it so easy to get hold of things. If you're in my game, which is researching, in the old days, 20 years ago, I would have had to spend my days in libraries and asking for permission to access information that I can now just get to so easily. And I think we often take that for granted, but in societies where either internet access is limited, say in developing countries, you see that people there are desperate to get access to that information, or where there are environments where access to information is limited by the regime. That you can see that the regime itself can be very nervous about the impact on the security of their regime of having that access to knowledge.
So obviously you're saying access to internet, access to all of the knowledge is good. You touched on something in your talk that I thought was really interesting about how in terms of access to traditional media, that's kind of changed, because obviously you have all of the pop-ups. Sort of, I know if I go on to sort of like the Washington Post or something, it comes up with "please subscribe to us," and I usually won't pay it. And sort of you sort of compared that whole fake clickbaity news to real and genuine sort of news research and stuff. And do you think that's going to be something that's definitely going to have to be looked at and regulated in the future, and what are your sort of ideas on that side of things?
Yeah, I think it's a really important thing that's happening, and we must pay attention to it. Traditional journalistic revenues have collapsed because they have all been appropriated by the social media platforms, and that's actually because the platforms are much, much more effective at reaching people than traditional media were with their advertising. So they're much more efficient, but they're getting the revenue. That's okay and all well and good as long as we still have a free press. And if jobs are being lost at the rate that they are, 60% of US newsroom jobs have gone in the last 20 years, that's a problem for all of us, and we have to find a way as a society, if we value our democracy, of funding journalism. In this country, we have a licence fee for the BBC. That's one way of doing it. Another thing that people are talking about, and actually it's interesting to hear people like Mark Zuckerberg getting to this themselves, is some sort of levy by the social media platforms themselves in order to ensure that free journalism still exists.
And do you think that kind of levy, do you think that would work? Do you think that would help with it? Or do you then think there becomes the issues of like data collection and all of the sort of like streaming that there is towards this stuff? Do you think that's going to affect it?
Well, we'd have to see. I think you always need to have voluntary measures first and try them and see if they fail. I think with worldwide platforms, one challenge that I can immediately foresee is how you're going to do this in every country, and not every country might want it. But there needs to be something done. And if nothing is done, then we'll all be the poorer for it.
Or I guess, sort of, final question. We've had a very interesting discussion. I guess my final question is, what do you think was the best meme that came out of the 2016 presidential election? Is there anything like particularly entertaining that's really stuck in your mind?
Okay. Yeah, it's a dog wearing a Russian hat saying, "I blame the Russians."
Amazing. Thank you very much for joining me.